Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 313, I chat with Supervising Sound Editor Scott Hecker about his work in the movie business, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded July 21st, 2016. Episode 313, Movie Sound Editing. This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by Epson's new EcoTank printers. With Epson's line of SuperTank all-in-one printers, you can print thousands of documents without running out of ink. EcoTank is loaded and ready to print when you are. Visit epson.com/ecotank to find out more. And by Corning. Corning's incredibly durable Thunderbolt and USB 3-point optical cables are longer, thinner, lighter, and stronger. Go to corning.com/twit to save up to $130 on their superior Thunderbolt optical cables. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of absforum.com. This week, my guest geek is Scott Hecker, a supervising sound editor and sound designer working at a company called Formosa Features. Hey, Scott, welcome to the show.
How's it going there today, Scott?
Just great, thank you.
Awesome. We have Scott on Scott Crime today.
Indeed. Let's see if we can make some trouble, shall we?
There you go.
Those of you who are tuned in live at live.twit.tv can log into the chat room there, or you can go to irc.twit.tv. I'll be following the chat room, and if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat room, and I'll pass along as many as I can. It always helps if you put my screen name, which is my full name, Scott Wilkinson, no dots or dashes or spaces, in the message somewhere, because that way it shows up in a different color on my screen and my eye will be more naturally drawn to it. So, Scott, let's start with what exactly does a supervising sound editor and sound designer do?
My job starts in post-production. The first level of post-production is the film editing. The film editor is usually on production and tries to keep up and edit right behind camera. So, you know, as they shoot film, they're trying to keep up and keep all the scenes cut so that by the time they're done with production, they're pretty close to a rough cut. So as soon as production's done, sometimes we start that soon. That's usually when I start on the couple of Zack Snyder films that I've worked on. And then I collaborate with the director and the film editor. My job is to basically impart to my crew. It's a crew of many. And my crew accordions from a base crew of 4 or 5 to up to 10 people during the course of a schedule. It's my job to meet with the director and the editor, and we go through the film and spot and just talk about, first I want to get any ideas that they have about what their film should sound like. Just, you know, in general, any impressions or things that they have in mind. The thing I like working with Zach so much is that he pretty much just says, make it sound cool. So
he gives you carte blanche, really.
Well, he does, but it's really a cool creative process because I think he's interested in what my ideas are instead of trying to make me sort of try to acquiesce and acclimate to his sensibilities. I think he wants my initial instincts first, and then he can react. If he doesn't like some of my ideas, he's really upfront and honest, and he says, well, let's change this, let's change that. But bottom line, it's my job to impart all this information and my ideas, since I'm responsible for it, is to impart all my ideas to my various crew members that consist of sound designers, dialogue editors, ADR editors, which ADR is automated dialogue replacement for dialogue that's been compromised during the production, and then Foley editors as well. And it's my job to supervise the process from soup to nuts, from turning over the original version. We started a rough cut, And through the whole process, while we're developing sounds, they're still developing the cut of the film. So it's sort of a very fluid process, and it's my job to communicate, create new sounds, make sure all my editors have the sounds and material that we need, and to coordinate to make it like one person is doing everything effectively. But it just, if I could do it all, it would be awesome, but it's just not plausible with the type of schedules that we have. Through the years, the schedules have gotten more condensed. Obviously, since we're the last link in the chain before the release of a film, if everyone through the process has gone over schedule and over budget, guess where we end up? You know, we end up with less time and less money, but
you're the ones that are squeezed.
Exactly. So in general, that's my job in general.
You did not mention music editors or the composer, but since you're dealing with sound, I assume music is part of your mandate as well.
It is. Truthfully, the music editor is pretty much hired by the composer. Most top-notch composers have a favorite music editor, so I don't get in the way of that. Since I work with different composers all the time, they typically have their own favorite music editor that knows how to deal with their score, the recordings, and the style of music editing, and they create a shorthand. So I usually am not that involved. I do communicate with the music editor a lot. Once we end up at the final mix stage and we're all on the stage together, then I am holistically responsible for all the editors on the stage. But up to that point, during the creative process, the music editor is really just hooked up with the composer pretty much.
Mm-hmm. So really you're dealing more in the nuts and bolts kind of day-to-day operation with sound effects, dialogue, Foley, which is, it's always fascinated me. People, if you have a scene where somebody's walking on gravel, then you record somebody walking on a piece of some area of gravel, so you can record the sound of what that sounds like when you're walking on gravel.
Yeah,
I always
absolutely.
find that very interesting.
Yeah, Foley. Everyone loves Foley. I think it got really popular on the Universal tour when they actually created like one of the attractions where you could go on a stage and watch a Foley artist do Foley to a section of Miami Vice. And it was ironic because I actually worked on that for quite a while. But as tourists from the East Coast and Iowa and all over the country started going to the Universal tour and seeing this, it not only is cool, it looks fun, and it is fun, but boy, you try to do it. It looks easy. It's sort of like watching Tiger Woods play golf. It looks easy, but boy, you get up there and your cue comes up, and I was just befuddled. I'm not great at it. I do it occasionally, but obviously I hire professional Foley artists, and ironically, through the years, it's been my brother Gary Hecker, and so
what do you know?
I've got. Yeah, no, Gary is one of the top in the world, and anyone would tell you that, not just me as his brother, but sure. We've had a great relationship, and he knows the type of sounds I'm after, and so we have a great shorthand as well. So it's really fun working with him to create really cool sounds, and he's really gone above and beyond the typical job description of a Foley artist, which is primarily footsteps and then hand props, things that people handle. But he creates sound effects that are amazing. He's actually created explosions on the Foley stage, and I'm like, how did you do that? It's like, what the heck? And but it's really fun, man. He just gets off on it, and he works on a lot of huge films as well. And yeah, we have fun together. But Foley is a huge part of what we do. It embellishes a lot of the sound effects and sound effects design work that we do. And so they sort of collaborate and work together in unison.
Mm-hmm. Emily the Strange in the chat room is asking, is it ever required to reshoot a scene because the sound is just so badly corrupted that it's not even salvageable? That's really what ADR, automatic dialogue replacement, and Foley and stuff like that is about, isn't it? That you're going to replace the sound that was actually recorded when the footage was shot.
Absolutely. There's a lot of situations, especially if you're shooting a period film before there's airplanes and even cars. And on a production set, a lot of times, a lot of those real world sounds infect the production recording. And
I would never have thought of that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah. And also if you're in a scene of rain and they're using rain machines or wind machines to create wind to blow people's hair, it completely obliterates the dialogue track. So we're stuck with trying to re-record those performances on an ADR stage. And then anytime we're doing ADR and it's just a pure vocal recording, obviously we need to supplement that with Foley, footsteps, the character's cloth movement, his body movement, the things he or she touches, grabs, picks up, acts with, or whatever. And also Foley serves another purpose in that when we create what we call an M&E, it's a music and effects version of the film, we strip out all of the English dialogue so that we can send that mix to foreign territories so that they can add their language to our soundtrack, all of our sound effects and music. So when we strip out all those great production recordings, along with it go all of the production footsteps and the natural movement and the ambience of the room that they're in. So the Foley and the sound effects, we do 100%. A lot of people think that we just sort of sweeten or maybe add where we need here and there, but we really, we pretend like there is no sound recorded, basically, and we produce all the sounds that you see and plus sounds off camera, actions that you don't see on camera. So when they say that sound is 50% of the experience, I think I could argue that it's actually more, because the film only shows you what's on camera. Sound can tell part of the story for things that are happening off camera that you don't see. And that's especially where sound is even more important, when we humans can't see something and we rely on our sense of sound to tell us what's going on. There we are. That's an important part of our storytelling process.
I had never thought of that, but you're right. The camera only shows you what's in front of you. The sound will indicate what's all around you.
Absolutely.
And we're going to talk about that in a little while, but first I want to get a couple of quick comments in here from the chat room. One is from UJ, who I think recognizes your name. He says, did he do 300 and Dawn of the Dead?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yeah, Dawn of the Dead was the first film I worked with Zack Snyder, and 300 was the second film I worked with Zack. So
so you probably knew that Zack Snyder had done those movies, and you mentioned that you worked with him quite a bit. So it was a logical conclusion.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to work on all of Zack's films, so I've had a blast working with Zack. He's incredible to work with, and I think I think audiences really dig his films too, because he brings such a rich visual element to the screen. It's just such great eye candy, and he's such a good storyteller as well. So it's a pleasure working with him.
Well, Terry Kay in the chat room is saying pretty serious facilities at Formosa, and we have a picture actually of the outside of the Formosa studio, and I'd love for you to tell us just a moment about what is Formosa Films, or Formosa Features, I think is what it's called. There it is. What are we looking at here?
Well, right there, that's on the lot. That is
and what lot is that? Which studio is that on?
That's the old Goldwyn lot that's on Formosa Avenue in Hollywood, California.
Hence the name.
Yeah, it was Goldwyn Studio, and then Warner Brothers was there, and they used to call it Warner Hollywood. And then once it turned into like an independent film shooting lot, they just called it The Lot.
Oh, okay. So what is Formosa? What is it? A group of post-production people who the various directors and movie studios go to provide the services such as yours?
Yes, it is an independent sound editorial and mixing facility. I spent 13 years at Universal Studios, was actually director of sound editorial there, and once the management changed there with Comcast coming in and buying, things changed a lot. And I just thought, wow, at this course of my career, this would be a great time to do something else. And at that time, a famous independent sound editorial company named Sound Deluxe, which I'm sure you're familiar with,
Oh, yeah.
they were bought out. And so Bob Rosenthal, who was the president at Sound Deluxe, wanted to start another independent sound company. He was sad that Sound Deluxe ended, and he basically cherry picked, some of the supervisors at Sound Deluxe, and then he reached out to myself as well. And so I'm one of 12 feature supervisors at Formosa Group. It's generally called Formosa Group, and it's got different divisions. It's got features, it's got broadcast, it's got interactive, it's got mixing stages. It's pretty well diversified independent company, and it's flourishing and growing. It's just been around almost 3 years now, so it's in its infancy basically, but it's incorporated with a lot of chiseled veterans such as myself. So it's really a great company, a great vibe, really wonderful people, and they're super supportive. We've got top-notch technology, all the new stuff. So I couldn't be luckier as a sound supervisor to be working there.
Yeah, that's great. User 2513 says, he's what I want to be.
Watch out. Don't let your son grow up to be a sound editor.
So tell us real quick about how you got started.
I got started, before I got started professionally, I didn't even realize it, but as a kid growing up in Ohio, a couple streets over from my home was a heavily wooded area with ravines. And, being kids that we would always be in the woods, building tree forts and under a canopy of huge, huge, tall trees. And I just remember as a kid always marveling at the sound being under that canopy and how reverberant everything was, from woodpeckers pecking on trees to birds chirping. And we would catch crayfish in the stream. And I just remember always being really aware of how things sounded, the babbling brook and the birds and the wind through the trees gusting. And so I didn't know it, but I think really my inkling was there. And then my dad told me, like when I was, 1.5, I was doing the twist to, I was just like a musical sound guy from the get-go, I think. And sort of always had a hankering that. I was an amateur drummer. I'm a music freak. Collect music and whatnot. Anyway, from Ohio, I graduated, went to Akron University, and when I was 21, I came out and got a job at Angel Editorial as a driver. And I started as a driver / apprentice, and everything in 1977, when I was 21, was still on film. So my job was to drive around town and pick up and drop off various sound elements and things to the different studios and facilities. And in that, I got to meet a lot of people. And so it was really an eye-opener and a great opportunity for me to meet all the different people in the community. It's a pretty small community, really. And so that was my start, my humble beginnings. And Bob Rutledge was the head of Angel Editorial. Actually, his mother, Evelyn, started it and passed it on to Bob Rutledge. And Bob was my mentor. And I started as a driver. I ended up his assistant. His mom had a mild heart attack 2 years after I started. And he said, "You've got to start editing. My mom can't edit anymore, and we've got these shows to turn out." So I started on Hanna-Barbera cartoons and had a gas with that. And I think it was a really good place for a sound editor to start, because creatively, you're not tied to the real world. It's cartoons. So it's like, what's the most fun sound I could come up with for this action? So it really was a fun way and a liberating way for me to start and cut my teeth in this world. And but Bob didn't just work on cartoons. He was an editor, a sound editor on the first Star Wars. And when I moved out in 1977, Star Wars had just come out. Before I came out here, I called him and I said, "Hey, Bob, what are you working on?" And he goes, Scott, I'm working on this really cheesy kids film. It's some space movie. And he said, I'm cutting spaceship sounds to old World War II fighter footage. And I said, I don't get it. And he goes, well, they don't have the visual effects, the special effects done yet. So they're sort of using old World War II footage, plane footage of, so I'm cutting spaceship sounds to the movements of those planes.
Wow.
And so anyway, I landed here literally. I flew here on the day Star Wars was released on, I think, well, shortly thereafter, June 21st. So it was a little bit after. But that was my start here with Bob, and I worked with Bob all the way through till 1988. And his company, Angel Editorial, early on changed to Blue Light Sound. And they were one of the high-end independent sound facilities at the time. And so that was my introduction. And as of 1988, I sort of got into the independent world, struck out on my own, and yeah, that was the beginning of it.
So really, I think what you're saying is if you can get into a situation as an intern or a driver or whatever, and find yourself a mentor and work your way up from there, huh?
Absolutely. It's great to have interns. It was tough at Universal because the union part was so strict that they really wouldn't let anyone do anything hands-on, because I think some of the people started taking advantage of interns, and started using low-paid interns instead of hiring, super experienced union folks. But bottom line, yeah, it's a great way to go if you can get an internship with a good company and find someone that's inspired to take you under their wing. There's nothing better than that. So
yeah. Well, we got a lot more to talk about. Got some more questions in the chat room, but before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank one of our sponsors for this episode, which is Epson. Now, Epson's revolutionary cartridge-free EcoTank line of printers for home and office introduce a new age in printing. The EcoTank ET4550 wireless all-in-one printer doesn't use ink cartridges. Instead, it features an amazing, innovative, refillable ink tank, earning it the title of CES 2016 Innovation Awards honoree. No more out-of-ink frustration for you. It includes up to 2 years of ink, equal to 11,000 black pages or 8,500 color pages. You can save up to 80% on ink with low-cost replacement ink bottles. It's also powered by Epson's Precision Core printing technology. It has auto two-sided printing and a 30-page auto document feeder and easy wireless printing from tablets and smartphones. All EcoTank printers deliver an unbeatable combination of convenience and value. With Epson's EcoTank line of printers, you'll have the freedom to print without running out of ink. The Epson EcoTank system was named the 2016 Small Biz Windows Printer of the Year. So visit epson.com/ecotank today to transform the way your home, office, or work group prints. For the best combination of ease and value, turn to the Epson EcoTank printers. That's epson.com/ecotank. And we thank Epson very much for their support of Home Theater Geeks. Epson, exceed your vision. So I wanted to ask you about whether, since you apparently work at the section called Formosa Features, I guess you probably work mostly on commercial cinema releases rather than home releases. Or am I wrong about that? Do you do one or the other or both?
Pretty much the way it goes is I work on feature films pretty much exclusively. Earlier in my career, I worked on quite a bit of TV, including Miami Vice and Crime Story and different shows like that. But yeah, I focus on feature films. And then obviously the films that I work on end up in everyone's home on a DVD or streaming or whatever. So eventually it does get to the home viewer. But yeah, I'm ensconced in the feature world. So.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you what the differences were. But if you don't work on the Blu-ray releases very much, then you might not have that information. In particular, somebody in the chat room was asking, who was it? UJ, do you work on or have any influence on the Blu-ray mix?
I do participate in it, but I leave the technical aspect up to the mixers, because truthfully, that's all about taking a theatrical mix and making sure that the compression is adjusted for the home viewer. As you know, there's nothing worse than sitting with your remote, turning up the dialogue because you can't hear the dialogue, and then an explosion comes on and your house blows up.
Man, I hate when that happens. Really.
Well, when you're watching a show, a show like that on DVD, it's one or two things. It's either possibly poorly mixed, or it's not gotten a near field mix. Sometimes they just put the theatrical mix on the DVDs. So
really,
no,
I would have thought that would be rare, if ever, because I mean the professionals that are in your business must know that the situation is very different at home than it is in a commercial cinema.
Yeah, no, I think more and more now studios, especially on high-end releases, they definitely endeavor to do near-field mixes. It's sort of a no-brainer. But until recently, some studios were just sort of not thinking that way. They just said, "Nah, put the theatrical mix on there," and there you were, like clutching your remote the whole movie, going up and down. So, no, it was great. On this one, it did. On Batman Superman, it did get a really good, I just listened to it last night, and it got a really good near field mix. It was great. And it had been a while since I'd heard the film. We were done mixing in March, so it's been a number of months since I heard it, and it was the first time I heard it in my home. So it was pretty cool. It translated very well, and I was happy with the results. And I think
that's great.
Yeah, in the theater, the dynamic range is so huge that for the near field mix, they sort of have to, narrow that dynamic range so that for the presentation in a near field mix, and also because we're listening near field, when we're mixing in a huge mixing stage for the theatrical, you don't hear some of the ticks and pops and things. Sometimes you get in a near field mix, you're like, wow, there's a lot more snap. You're just noticing more mouth pops and ticks and clicks and snaps. So part of it is editing too. You sort of have to edit out, a lot of that stuff with headphones on, and really try to anticipate the experience of someone in their living room watching on their screens at home. So it's really critical to get a nice mix on there to make it a good presentation.
Well, I was going to ask you if the people in your group, in the Formosa group anyway, those who do the remixing for home, do they do it in a near field environment, which means in a commercial cinema, the speakers are very far away. In a home environment, they're much closer in what we call the near field. And so I'm curious to know if the sound editors or the remixers who prepare the soundtrack for home release, either Blu-ray, DVD, streaming, whatever, actually do near field. They have the equipment, the speakers in particular, much closer to them as it would be in a living room. And do they use consumer equipment, or do they still use professional monitoring equipment?
It goes both ways. Some of these mixes for home theater are done in smaller rooms. The last couple films, actually the big theatrical films like Batman, Superman, and Man of Steel, we actually did the near field mix on the large stage, but we bring in smaller speakers, but they're professional speakers, and we actually just bring them in tighter to the mixing console and surround ourselves with them in a close manner, and we set up like 5.1 or 7.1 near field mixing, so it's in a big room, but we're listening near field with the speakers surrounding us more immediately.
Which means the acoustics aren't quite the same as a home theater, because you've got the walls are very far away.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
So that must affect things in some way.
Slightly, but with the speakers so close to you, even though it's in a bigger space, you're getting you're getting a really direct signal from those speakers, so it's giving you a pretty good indication of what it would be like to be in the average living room, so to speak. And also, it's more expensive to do it on a larger stage. But on these films, on Batman versus Superman and Man of Steel, they just said, you know what, it's cool. We've got it in the budget. You can stay on the large stage. Some people, for the lower stage rate, they go to a smaller stage and do it that way. So, there's many ways to skin the cat. But hopefully, in the hands of a good mixer, it'll turn out nice, a good presentation for the viewer.
Yeah. User 2513 is asking a number of questions here, really sort of centered around the idea of, do you, when you're mixing for the home or remixing for the home, take into account that it might be listened to on a 5.1 system, it might be listened to on a sound bar, or maybe the TV's own speakers, God forbid. And I remember when I was more into music recording, audio recording, when you recorded something in a studio, you'd have really nice equipment, but then you'd also listen to it on kind of crappy equipment to see what it would sound like, the mix would sound like on less than ideal gear. Do you guys think about that at all?
Yes, there is only one near field mix per se, but occasionally we'll play back and at least check sections, especially big, loud, dynamic sections, on some smaller, cheaper, more consumer end speakers. So that always helps too. It gives you a reference as to what the average Joe might be hearing, but truthfully, they've got it down so they know how this stuff translates. Even if they wouldn't check it, they just from experience,
they will know.
Most of these mixers know how this stuff's going to translate. So that's the key, is to get a really good experienced mixer on these things.
Now, you've been in the business now quite a while. You started in the late 70s, early 80s. And so I wanted your take on sort of how movie sound has evolved since then. I mean, way back in the early days, it was all mono, of course. And then it went to stereo. And, then we had Dolby stereo, which is where you sort of come into the picture. So give us your sort of feeling about what has happened to movie sound during the time you've been in the business and how that has affected what you do.
Well, I'll tell you, it's, even if you have a good mono mix, it's amazing. Stanley Kubrick was a huge fan of mono mixes, and I forget which film it was of his that I watched, and it blew me away. I thought it was in stereo, and I went back and I was like, wow, that was mono. And but he was a huge fan. He didn't trust the technology so much, and he was sort of reticent, and slowly but surely he embraced all the different sound formats. But yeah, a good mix is a good mix. I mean, bottom line, if you don't understand the dialogue, you're lost. So, mixers can get fancy and start spraying sounds all over the room, but truthfully, the dialogue is the backbone of the sound job. And so as these formats started to expand to stereo and then Dolby stereo, the sound field expanded and it became increasingly more immersive. When I first started.
And I would think, pardon me for interrupting, but I would think also that as the number of channels increased and the sound stage expanded, as you say, that might have meant that dialogue was kind of easier to make sure it was present and audible and so on, because you could move the other sound elements kind of around the sound stage away from where the dialogue was coming from, which is typically directly dead center.
Absolutely, you're right in that. With the multi-channel formats, at least dialogue sort of has its own center channel. It's funny because when they had the Matrix Dolby A, the early Dolby stereo, there were certain anomalies with certain stereo sounds depending on the phase relationship of certain sounds, because sound effects, they're all recorded over a long number of years, and they come from different sources. And so sometimes in the mix, certain stereo sounds would just, the matrix would fold the sound and it would flop straight to the center and basically beat up on the dialogue and things like that. So not until we got into discrete sound formats, 5.1 and Dolby Digital and whatnot, were we able to honestly and dependently articulate exactly what speaker each sound was coming from. So yeah, you're right. The center channel, at least the dialogue's got a home of its own there. And then, music is usually focused in the left and the right, with some of the reverb sending to the surround speakers, or putting direct music or sound effects in the surround speakers too, just depending on the taste. But personally, I'm not a fan of too many specific hard sounds being in the surrounds. It sort of takes me out of a movie, since when you're in a movie theater, the movie's up on the screen, and I sort of like using the surrounds more atmospherically than putting specific sounds, unless you're trying to tell a story of where a sound is coming from,
Exactly.
off stage.
What you said earlier about how the sound mix lets you have elements of the story that aren't on the screen.
Definitely. And so that's a cool thing. If you have to tell the audience that a sound is coming from behind them or off to the side, then that sound specifically gets panned to that speaker. But atmospherically, I like where the focus is on the front of the screen and the front three speakers, left, center, right, and let the atmospherics of the backgrounds and the music sort of waft into the surrounds to sort of envelop you into the atmosphere versus distracting you.
How do you feel about the new immersive audio formats? Dolby Atmos is probably the most common in theaters around the country, and in home theaters for that matter. But there's also DTSX and Oro 3D. Have you worked in those much? And if so, what do you think? Do they add to your burden or do they add to your opportunity?
Both, which is a good thing. It's a lot of fun working on the Atmos version. Definitely. Anytime you can articulate more specifically where sounds are coming from and to envelop and immerse the audience, they're going to have a more real experience. It's the way our brain works, the way our ears hear, and the way our brain interprets what we hear. We're used to hearing sounds all over and very directional. So, Dolby Atmos is amazing in articulating the brain. It's probably the closest thing to, how our ears and brain hear things. So I love it. I absolutely love it. Just like anything, it's a really powerful tool, and in the wrong hands, people start, if people start trying to get too cute or tricky with reinventing the original mix, I'm not a huge fan of that. And on the films that I work on, we endeavor to retain the integrity of the mix that we've spent, many days, weeks, and sometimes months mixing with the director and the film editor, myself, and the mixers in a room, making thousands of decisions on how the film's going to sound. And when we go to do the Atmos version, the last thing you want to do is undo that. So you really want to just, mostly in the upper speakers, we try to just keep those speakers for things that literally fly over our head, or atmospheres, wind, birds, rain, different things like that. So I like to just use those upper speakers in that way. And then obviously with all the extra speakers around the perimeter of the theater, you can more specifically locate the sounds in the room. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I found that I recently saw the BFG. I don't think you worked on that one. I might be wrong, but
no, I haven't. I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, it's really good. It's a really good movie, a really good Atmos mix too, where they've got things very pinpoint, things happening off screen, and they're clearly pinpointed as to where they're supposed to be happening. So I really like that. Another thing that I've noticed in Atmos mixes more recently, is that the music is being brought out into the room, so into the surrounds, into the overheads.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest advantage, is taking the music off the screen, because the music isn't tied to, there's nothing physical on the screen that the music is representing. It's more of an emotional tool. So no, you couldn't be more right. It's great when you can separate the low strings from the high strings, bring some of the high strings into the room a little and separate them from the low strings. Or if you have choir, a lot of times in Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman, Hans Zimmer uses a lot of choirs, and there's nothing more cool to hear a choir in the upper speakers, man. It sounds like the heavens singing,
Yeah.
Really, really great. So no, it's great. And we have all, typically the composers give us a lot of separation from the strings, from the brass, from the percussion, guitars.
You get those as sort of separate pre-mixed tracks?
Separate stems, yes. They're separate
called
mix
stems,
sounds.
yeah.
Yeah, we call them stems, and so that.
Why is that? I've heard that word for a long time, and I don't know why they're called that.
You know what? I think it might go back to stereo mono mixes. We would have a dialogue mono stem, a sound effects mono stem, and a music mono stem. And they used to record them on mag, 3-stripe mag. It was literally like film with 3 magnetic stripes on it. And to one stripe, you'd record the dialogue, the other the music, and the third the effects. And I think because it sort of looks like a brown stripe on the actual film, the iron oxide, it sort of looks like a stem. I could be wrong, but that's sort of my impression of
sort of a stem of a plant in a way.
Exactly. And so
never heard that before, but
anything that's separated out, we typically call them stems. We have various stems that we record for the final mixes. We record background. We have a background stem, which is just atmospheres only. We have a heart effect stem, which is full of all of the practical sounds, heart effects, car doors opening and closing, gunshots whatsoever. And then we have a sound design stem for more impressionistic sounds, trippy, cool sounds that are impressionistic. And then we have Foley footstep stem. We keep the footsteps separate from the Foley props. And we have a separate production dialogue stem. We have a separate ADR stem. And then we have a separate music stem. So we keep all that separate so that if we need to mix different versions of the film down the road, we always have maximum flexibility and separation to do that. So everything's not all tied together.
Now, we've been talking about some of the advantages of immersive sound. Can you think of any disadvantages? The one that comes to mind, perhaps, is that there's sort of too much option. There are too many options. Where do you put these sounds? There's so many places you could do it that it kind of maybe opens up too much option. Maybe not, though. I don't know.
Well, I think you're right, and it goes back to being in the right hands. It is a powerful tool, and if a mixer starts getting too gimmicky or cute, it can actually affect how the audience perceives where the sounds are coming from and why am I hearing that sound there. Yeah, it gets pretty tricky. If it's not handled right, it can be confusing. And the other thing that I find as a slight disadvantage is because most of the theaters now are not home theaters, but in theatrical, because they're stadium seating. If you're seated in the back of the theater up higher, you're closer to those ceiling theaters. So all of a sudden, or the speakers, I'm sorry. So all of a sudden, those Atmos tracks are louder than intended, really, because when we're mixing in a mix stage, all those speakers on the ceiling are equidistant from our ears. So that is a slight disadvantage, being in the back in a stadium seating environment with those Atmos speakers closer to your head. So that's the only immediate one, other than just, people, like I said, trying to get too cute or gimmicky with the process.
I think I heard some examples of that early on when Atmos first came out, but as with multi-channel music mixing, which I've spent a great deal of time thinking about and studying, it got better over time as people got more experienced with the tool, the new tool, and they were able to do more interesting and less gimmicky stuff. So I think that's probably true of any new tool that comes up.
Sure. Yeah. You want to play with it and see what it can do, You sort of want to.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's just try to break this for a while.
A new toy. Yeah. Well, listen, we got some more lots of more things to talk about. But before we do, I'd like to thank our other sponsor for this episode, which is Corning. Now, Corning can greatly improve your audio-video workflow with strong, durable, and far-reaching Thunderbolt and USB 3.0 fiber optic cables. Whether you're into high-end video, photography, audio production, or computing, Corning's optical cables will allow you to build a convenient workspace through a superior long-distance connection. Corning's USB 3.0 and Thunderbolt cables are incredibly strong and flexible. They have exceptional cable runs of up to 60 meters or 200 feet for Thunderbolt and 50 meters or 165 feet for USB 3, making it so easy to move noisy, space-consuming devices away from your workspace. Corning's cables are hot swappable, and you can daisy chain up to 6 Thunderbolt devices. You can bend or walk on Corning's ultra-slim cables as well, and even if they're tangled, they will still keep transmitting at top speed. Now, Universal Audio, which is a company that makes professional audio equipment, relies on optical cables by Corning to achieve acoustic isolation in their studio where they test new equipment, such as their best-selling Thunderbolt audio interfaces. I can tell you from my time in the professional audio realm that Universal Audio is among the most well-respected companies out there, and so they do things the right way, and I'm very pleased to hear that they use optical cables by Corning to remove noisy equipment from where they're actually doing some measurements. Instead of investing in multiple extenders, adapters, and cables, turn to Corning to establish the connection you need with one simple, long-length cable. Corning's products are available at all major electronics and professional AV retailers, including Apple stores, Amazon, B&H, and more. Corning's cables are longer, thinner, lighter, and stronger. Go to corning.com/twit to save up to $130 on Thunderbolt optical cables. This promotion is valid only from June 1st to July 31st, or while supplies last, whichever occurs first. Just go to corning.com/twit to save on their unbeatable Thunderbolt cables. And we thank Corning very much for their support of Home Theater Geeks. I'm sure, Scott, that you must have to put noisy equipment away from where you're doing the mixing to not mess up your perception of what you're really trying to hear, right?
Absolutely. Quiet environment rules. It was really fun back in the film days when we worked on a moviola, man. Those things were so loud. It sounded like an airplane. And so obviously you always had to wear headphones to block out that sound. But yeah, on a mix stage, it's a very quiet environment and really tight, airtight, and everyone keeps quiet and ears open.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you. I've long been an advocate for reasonable volume levels in theaters, and often they aren't. They're really loud. And I've known a lot of mixers who mix at very high volumes. And so I wanted to get your take on that. Do you mix at these high volumes? And even if not, why do you suppose people often do?
I'm not a fan of super loud mixes. I actually get irritated, if the sound is too loud, especially if it hurts my ears. It's like I'm trying to enjoy myself and take the experience in. It's strange on a mix stage. We all have a talk, at least I have, because I'm really sensitive to that. And especially working on big dynamic films, lately Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman, we know we're going to have some really busy, active action scenes. And I just, we had a discussion. Let's really be aware. We've got all the technology. We've got the metering systems that we can see how loud this is getting. And let's be responsible and not get too loud. And, you get in there and all of a sudden there's the directors there and the film editor, myself, the mixers. And it is exciting. When you hear sound loud, especially when it's produced with high fidelity and great sounds, it's fun. It's exciting, but you really have to be cognizant of the overall effect of 2 to 2.5 hours of an audience enduring that. And so I will say that personally on these films, I still can watch the film, and there's still a couple short sections that are a little too loud for me. But some people go, Scott, the audience only hears it one time. You're on a dub stage for 10 hours a day. It's like being at a rock concert for 10 hours a day. So obviously I'm going to be more sensitive to it than someone who's paid good money to watch a 2.5-hour action film. So yeah, I'm sensitive to it too, Scott. When
I go to the theaters, when I go to the theaters, I always bring a sound meter and measure the levels over the entire length of the movie. And sometimes they get pretty darn loud. Batman v Superman, for example, was quite loud.
Yes.
Again, that's partly due to the exhibitor, right? The individual theater that you're in. There is a reference level. And
yes.
So I guess that would be my next question. Do you listen at reference level at least some of the time?
Oh, we are all day, every day on the mix stage. We're listening at 85, and
that's 85 dBA, I believe.
Right, but it's still loud, man.
That's loud. That's really loud.
Yeah. With some of the peaks, it gets up, to 120 decibels. I mean, it doesn't sustain that high, but that's loud.
I couldn't agree more.
But
I wish the reference level was lower. I really do.
Well, it all comes down to the theater, the exhibitors, because, a lot of people in some of the larger chains, they actually play the movies low. And I have the opposite reaction. I get irritated when I pay good money and it's like, this thing is turned down. I actually went up into the projection booth at one of the chains one time, and they showed me that the setting on their projector, it's supposed to play at 7. And this particular film was at like 4.5 or 5 or something. And I said, why aren't you playing this at reference level? And he said, well, a lot of people complain that it's too loud. And then you also have in the multiplexes, if you're listening to a really cool drama, you're watching a nice, theatrical drama, and next door is Transformers 5. So they have to do that. But when you go to some of these upscale places, the ArcLight and some of the other high-end theaters, typically they'll play it at reference or pretty darn close to reference, and that's where you get exposed to the levels that we experience on a mixed stage. So,
yeah. Well, actually, user 2513, Hamid, otherwise known as, says, yeah, loud's no good, but if the sound should be mad loud, then make it so. Again, pretend it's really happening. That's my philosophy of how these movies should be, as if it were reality. And, he's got a point.
Absolutely. I worked on Mad Max, the latest Mad Max, and that movie inherently is just, it's fairly bombastic, but in a great, great way. It was so much fun, and visually it's so vibrant and loud and active and dynamic. If the sound doesn't match that, your brain does have a disconnect. So that movie rocked, man. I'll tell you.
We're looking at a still from it. I happen to show, and those of you who are watching the video, this is one of my favorite shots out of that movie. I mean, it's an amazing movie, kind of disturbing, but the picture of this guy in his red jumpsuit playing a guitar with flames shooting out of it, and this wall of speakers on a car, on a moving vehicle. I mean, that right there, that must have been an interesting challenge to make the sound of that guy playing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That character's name is the Doof Warrior. And And it really goes back, if you think about all those cars sort of being like an army. Back in the day, you had the drummer and the fife. You had the drummer and the flute player.
Ah, of course, of
And
course.
so the doof warrior was the Armada's musician. And in this case, it is rock and roll. And yeah, so
Wow.
Junkie XL ended up playing a lot of those parts. Tom Holkenberg is his name, but his acronym is Junkie XL.
You mean
And
he's a musician, guitar player?
he's a musician and a composer. He's actually was a co-composer on Batman Superman with Hans Zimmer. And so we worked with him. He was the composer on Mad Max as well. And yeah, he rocks. Tom's awesome.
Well, I wanted to ask you in the few minutes we have left, if there were any interesting anecdotes you can share with us from Batman v Superman or Mad Max. Batman v Superman, by the way, just got released to the home in the last day or two on Blu-ray and streaming and so on. So I'm curious to know, if there were any interesting anecdotes you can share from your work on that movie, Batman v Superman, or Mad Max, Fury Road, or even the original Man of Steel, which the Batman v Superman was a sequel to that.
Yeah, both of them had a lot of fun experiences. We did a lot of field recording on Man of Steel. There was so many sounds that we had some stuff in the library, but we really wanted to make it special. And on that film, we went out and recorded military vehicles. There was so much destruction in the film that we went out and recorded cement crashes. We actually went out in Fillmore, California here, and it was nice and quiet. And we found this guy that had sort of like I don't know if you're familiar with these telephone poles that are sort of made of cement and stone, sort of old school. Well, there was like a cemetery of these things, like 200 of them. And we bought a K-rail, a freeway K-rail, construction K-rail, which was like 3,000 pounds, got a forklift, and we went out and, raised the K-rail like, 50 feet in the air and dropped them on the cemetery, the 200 different cement street poles. And then we started picking up the street poles and smashing those and dragging the K-rail over the mountain of street poles. So we accumulated an amazing library of cement crashes and metal crashes and whatnot. But I think really the most fun recording episode we had, since there was some military cooperation in Man of Steel, we were able to go out to Edwards Air Force Base and record a C-17, which was actually in that film. We got to plant 17 different microphones all over the C-17, and we recorded from the cockpit to the cargo area, all over, and it was just amazing. And in the meantime, we also got to record some Black Hawk helicopters that were on at Edwards. And then in the Smallville battle, you might notice that there were A-10 Warthogs in there participating as part of the military arsenal.
And what are those? I don't know that name.
The A-10 Warthogs it's like an old battle warcraft that was used in Vietnam, and they're super powerful. And these are
land vehicles?
No, I'm sorry. These are jets, fighter jets.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
A-10 Warthogs, and they have cannons on them that it's stunning. That's the only place you can see these things. They're at Montham Davis Air Force Base in Arizona. So they flew us there, and they let us record their testing sessions. We couldn't tell them like what maneuvers to do, but we got to record anything and everything that they did. We had the advantage of they had a couple of towers there, 50-foot towers. So we got on a 50-foot tower, and they let us have a pilot that was licensed to fly one of these beasts as low as 50 feet. So we got really great close-up recordings of these things. And when you record a sound, you never can capture the full dynamics of the size and scope of that, because the digital recorders just can't handle that kind of signal, so you have to lower your recording signals accordingly. So it's just like looking at the Grand Canyon in person and looking at a picture of it. You had to be there. So but it was amazing hearing that cannon fire. It was so scary. I could not imagine being on the receiving end in battle of one of those A-10 Warthogs. Oh my Lord. We actually put a small a real cheap recorder in the strafing pit, so we could record the actual impacts of the rounds hitting the strafing pit.
Wow.
And the recording that we got was amazing. And we actually used that recording in the Smallville battle, where the A-10 Warthogs are firing and ripping up the streets. The asphalt's just being shredded. And so we were
I remember that in the movie. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. The A-10 Warthogs, they couldn't really film them, so most of those were CG, believe it or not. If you watch, if you watch the movie, it looks real as hell. But most of them were CG, so they could have control over that as far as what they were doing maneuver-wise and whatnot. So it was really exciting getting to go to those couple different military bases and being able to record such dynamic vehicles.
Your comment about recording the sound of the plane flying just overhead and being so loud, you got to turn down the input level on the recorder, makes me wonder if using what we call high resolution audio at 24-bit depth instead of 16-bit, which gives you greater dynamic range, if that affords you any advantage. I assume you probably record with 24-bit resolution when you're out in the field anyway, right?
Absolutely. 24-bit all the time, sometimes up to 192K. Yeah, so we're into as high fidelity as possible. Sometimes 192 is a little overkill, but a lot of field recording we do at like 96K. And not only for fidelity's sake, but it also affords us the ability to take those recordings, those such high fidelity recordings, and process them. A lot of times if you have a lower resolution sound recording and you start to process it, you start to hear more artifacts sooner. So with these type of recordings, 96K or 192 recordings, you can really slow things down. Really, it's beautiful with really clean sound with hardly any artifacts. So that's what we really take advantage of, those higher sampling rates and really go to town with manipulation and processing.
Makes a lot of sense. Radio Rod in the chat room is asking, what plugin do you prefer when doing ADR? I was made aware of some relatively new technology like Vocaline Pro that lines up the poor on-location sound with the new ADR recordings, which in theory should make lip sync perfect without having the actor have to be super great at ADR.
We endeavor on the ADR stage, if we have time, we try to do as many takes as it does take to get good sync. I mean, our main goal is to get a great performance always, but the less editing that goes on, the better. And yes, Vocaline works. I'm not really too learned in all the different processors on that in that line, because truthfully, we edit the ADR. We actually physically edit it to match. Sometimes you use Vocaline to get it close, but you don't want to. You try to use as little processing as possible in the process. At least I do. I'm more of a purist, and I'd rather my ADR editor physically edit the line and put it in sync versus having. But there's different programs that stretch and pull audio to match the production track, and I'm not super familiar with all of them, but Vocaline is very popular.
Yeah. Okay. One last question then. In your extensive filmography, there are a number of music documentaries. For example, U2, Rattle and Hum, and Madonna, Truth or Dare, which are those are pretty old. Those have been, 20 plus years. But is there anything different you need to think about when doing a music documentary, such as those?
Well, those particular, working on Rattle and Hum was a gas, but like you say, that was in 1988.
Yeah.
And documentary is a completely different feel. I've only worked on a handful of documentaries, but I love it just because I like variation, and it's always interesting, especially if you're working on something super interesting that is, your passion. And music is a huge passion of mine. And in the late 80s, U2 was one of my favorite bands. And so to be able to work with those guys, oh my Lord, that was awesome. I had such a great experience and so much fun. But bottom line is, to create the sounds in 5.1, we went to A&M Records, and we had full run of all the 24-track recordings of 35 concerts that they recorded across the United States. And they actually recorded 6 channels of audience sound. They had 2 microphones on the stage. They had 2 microphones at the mixing console. And then they had 2 microphones in the rear of the venue. We found that the 2 microphones at the rear of the venue were not so great. So we really just sort of took advantage of those 4 channels of discrete crowd ambience. And you're probably thinking like, well, those microphones recording the crowd has also got all that loud music. So we had to go through 35 concerts and create a crowd library. The only place that we could get clean crowd sounds are before the band comes out, in between songs when a crowd cheers at the end of a song, especially a song we were hoping we would go to songs that ended abruptly, so that the song, it wasn't like a reverberant ending where the end of the music was going into the crowd reaction. And then obviously encore crowds, things like that. Or when Bono would say, we love being in Boston, and the crowd would go crazy. So a lot of times we just took any crowd that we could get between songs, before the band came out, encore crowds, and made a huge library, and then recreated the crowd reactions for each song using these pure crowd sounds, so that we didn't have to use the contaminated crowd mics that had the music tied to it. So we had total control over the crowds and then the music.
Well, it sounds like great fun. Your job sounds like it's really great fun. And I know there's at least one person in the chat room who said, yeah, that's what I want to do. So
well, that's cool.
Great to have you on the show and talk about what you do, and hopefully inspire others to get into the field, because it really is a lot of fun, as you have clearly indicated to us. I want to thank you for having me. Oh, thank you so much for being here. That's Scott Hecker. He is supervising sound editor and sound designer at Formosa Group. You can learn more about Formosa Group at formosagroup.com. You can find me always at avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv. And you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott and at avsforum. You can always find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here on twit.tv/htg and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twit Home Theater Geeks. Next week, my guest geeks are scheduled to be Mark Waldrop and Scott Wilker, another Scott yet, who have joined together to start a new venture, building and designing a very new, very interesting speaker product. So they're going to be here to talk about that, and I think it's going to be very interesting. So I do hope you will join us. Until then, geek out.